Hello, Keith Herman,
Hello.
Professor of Counseling Psychology and co-director of the Missouri Prevention Science Institute. Welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this interview on teacher stress.
Sure, happy to talk to you.
I really wanted to take this opportunity during this COVID-19 pandemic and really shift some focus on not the need to really develop online instruction and things, but the added layer of pressure and stress that may add to teachers who are already struggling um, in handling their coping, or just for teachers who have really good strategies. But this is a trying time. A lot of teachers have a lot of concerns and justifiable concerns about students and reaching out and things. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to interview an expert in this area to share some hope and strategies for teachers in dealing with stress in general, and particularly during this time. So can you provide a little bit about your background before we get into our brief interview?
Sure. So I'm a professor in counseling and school psychology here at Mizzou. As you said, I'm a director of the Missouri Prevention Science Institute, and two of our big local projects involve the Family Access Center of Excellence, which is a free resource for any family in Boone County to access mental health services for their child. And I'm also involved in the Boone County Schools Mental Health Coalition, which is a county-wide school mental health initiative to support the mental health needs of every youth in our county, pre-K through high school.
Great, thank you. I think that's very helpful to understand not only your research expertise, but how you're applying that to really help practitioners on a local level. So that's just really wonderful and important to share. So the first question I wanted to ask you to discuss a little bit about is, how does research help us understand stress as it relates to teachers?
Sure. So research is a really valuable tool for helping us to understand the causes of stress and how common it is and how to intervene in it. And so in terms of just knowing about the prevalence of stress among teachers, research has for several decades shown us that teaching is one of the most stressful occupations. Our own recent research here in Missouri has supported those findings by showing that the vast majority of teachers are telling us that they're stressed in their jobs. They experience a lot of stress in their jobs. About 94% of teachers tell us on a scale from 1 to 10 that they're about an 8 or 9 in terms of the amount of stress that they experience. Research also tells us, though, that even though teachers are telling us they're stressed, the majority of them are telling us that they're actually coping well. And those two pieces we know are important parts of this stress experience. It's not just the experience of stress that's harmful. Stress is actually adaptive. It's just part of life. And so we also need to know that second part of the equation, which is how well people are dealing with stress. And so even though the majority of teachers are stressed, the majority are also telling us that they're coping well. Research tells us what the consequences of stress are as well. So that's another important component. And that is, for those teachers that are telling us that they're stressed and they're not coping well, we know that it's having a negative impact on their health, their well-being, and their likelihood of staying in the profession. And so that's an important implication for society. If we want to retain the best teachers, we need to find ways to identify those teachers who are struggling, who need support, and to reduce their stressors, but also to support their coping. Research also tells us that stress and low coping not only affects teachers, it affects the students in their classrooms. Yeah. And so research shows that kids in those classrooms of teachers who are telling us they're stressed and they're not coping as well, the students are learning less, they have more behavior problems, they have fewer pro-social skills that they develop during the academic year, and they're more at risk for internalizing problems as well. And so it's this cycle of, if we want to support kids, we really have to support the teachers, and we need to support them in learning to have lower levels of stress, but also how to cope more effectively. And then lastly, I would say that research is really important in that it tells us what works in helping teachers through these challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And so just as one example, my doctoral student, Colleen Eddy, just completed her dissertation on a really brief intervention, which involved reading a book on stress management for teachers and attending a few webinars. And she showed in a randomized trial here, just right here in Boone County, that teachers who were exposed to that training had not only significantly lower levels of stress and higher levels of coping after that, they also had lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression, and also lower levels of substance abuse. And so this really brief intervention, acquainting teachers with some, basic but effective science-based coping skills had benefit for them. And so research helps us do all those things to support teachers to be as effective and as healthy as they can be.
Yeah, that's great. And that was my second question, is to talk a little bit about the importance of having these strategies to manage stress. I was wondering, I'm going to throw a question at you that wasn't on the interview, but it sounds very familiar, and parallels a bit maybe the parental stress literature. Do you see some commonalities across with um, parenting stress and then parenting coping and the effects on children? Are there mirrored findings with teacher stress?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the human stress experience is common. I think the main contribution we tried to make in some of our work is to give specific examples of things that are stressful for teachers that we know teachers tell us, and then to give them strategies to cope with those particular stressors. But absolutely, I think there's strong parallels between adult relationships with their children and teacher relationships with students, and how that impacts youth development, either in positive ways or it can be detrimental when the adults in their lives are not coping effectively with stress.
Yeah, it sure seems like kids learn how to manage their own stress through watching their adults'
Yeah.
interactions with them. So
Yeah.
very, very important work, Keith. So thank you very much for your work in this area. I did want to, you've already talked about some simple strategies, and I don't know if you could pull in some more from either the book that you wrote or the intervention, but if you can just name a few simple strategies teachers could put in place, that would be, I think, super helpful for people.
Sure. And one thing I do want to just say, as I always try to have this disclaimer, Melissa, when I talk about this, and that is, I do focus a lot on supporting individual teacher coping with stress. And I do that because I think in my own work, I've noticed that a lot of teachers have not been acquainted with these models, these evidence-based models for effective coping. And so I want to share that with them. At the same time, I'm careful not to solely focus on teachers as the sole cause of stress in their life.
Sure.
There's a system that surrounds teachers, and it's a stressful system, and the context matters. And so I think we should be working on both ends of the equation at the same time. So finding ways to make that context less stressful, finding ways for school leaders to support teachers more effectively, for communities to support teachers more effectively. I think that's a major part of the equation. I think at the same time, this coping component complements those efforts to change context. And in the absence of context change, which some contexts don't change,
Yeah.
teachers still can use some of these strategies to manage some of these inevitable stressors in their work lives. But in terms of simple strategies, I'm thinking specifically about the current COVID crisis that is so burdensome for teachers now. I think one of the reasons that disasters and crises can be so unsettling, disruptive, and stressful for humans is because it takes us out of our routines.
Yeah.
And so when we lose our routines, we lose our bearings, and we tend to get more anxious, more worried, and more stressed because of that. And so one of the most fundamental things we can do for ourselves as teachers, as adults, is to find ways to maintain routines or to create new routines, to
Sure.
create schedules. Even if I'm not driving to work every day, I have to put in some structure. What time am I going to get up? What is my first thing I do in the day? Those schedules make a major impact on how well we're able to cope with stress. And in turn, our kids really, even more so, probably benefit from that structure and seeing us in those routines, because when life is unpredictable, we get anxious. And so the things that we have control over, like our schedules and routines, add predictability. And so I think that's a place where I would start with anybody in terms of getting centered, even in the midst of a crisis. Some other simple things, and it's part of a routine, is especially during times when we're being told to isolate, we know how important exercise and physical activity is in terms of maintaining positive mental health, reducing stress. Again, back to research, there's good research that shows that one of the best brief interventions for mild to moderate depression, or mild to moderate stress, is an exercise routine. And so I think it's just really important for all of us during this time, as much as we can find ways. Again, we're out of our routines. We maybe can't go to the gym or whatever our old routine was, but to find ways to stay active, because it makes such a significant effect on how well we are able to cope and deal with stressors in our life. And so I think some other strategies in terms of the basic model of how to cope with stress effectively. We know that the way that we think about events in our life has a major influence on how we feel about those events and how we feel about ourselves. And I think during crises like this one, we can have a lot of anxious thoughts that are sort of in the back of our head. So these catastrophic worries that we have about, oh, what's going to happen if, and usually we answer some of those questions in our heads. We have the worst case scenarios. It's just sort of floating around up here. And the more that we just let these fears just float and not talked about, the more anxious that we just feel throughout the day. And so one of the most important strategies that we can have is to get those fears out of our mouth, out of our head, to write them down, to be as specific as you can. What are you most worried about? And then once you actually get them out of your head onto paper or into the world, you can then evaluate it. You can evaluate, is this a helpful way for me to think about this right now? Is this helping me move forward? Is this helping me be productive? Or is it harming me in some way? And so it's this, through these sort of Socratic questions, we can start to develop maybe more adaptive thoughts about this process. And we encourage people to find out what some positive coping thoughts are that make them feel centered, happier, calmer. Those coping thoughts are very individual specific, because this is the important part of finding adaptive coping thoughts. Is we're not trying to put on rose-colored glasses and just say everything's fine. Let's just pretend like there's not a challenge here.
It's not denial.
Yeah, exactly. It's more about figuring out what are some real things that you do believe to be true that are more helpful and adaptive and calming for you right now. So things like, we're going to get through this. Pandemics don't last forever. I'm going to do I'm going to control what I have control over right now, which is, things in my family, things in my daily routine. And I'm going to let go of those things that I don't have any direct control over. Yeah. And so finding 4 or 5 coping thoughts that you believe in that are calming, writing them down, looking at them, saying them aloud. We know that you can, just as you can plant negative thought habits in your head, you can intentionally plant more adaptive thinking habits in your head. And it's those type of thoughts that really make a difference in how people deal with stressors in their life.
Sure. When teachers are able to find those adaptive thoughts, to process them, to write them down, that sounds like that would be a good opportunity to also teach children who have maladaptive thoughts, how to process that, potentially, if they would need that support. It doesn't seem like a support that would be harmful for anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times adults will model maladaptive thinking when they say
Yep.
things out loud, when they're really upset, they,
I
maybe
shouldn't have got out of bed today.
Right, exactly. So you're absolutely right. We might as well intentionally model adaptive thinking, because
Sure.
kids will do what adults model for them. And
Yeah.
so if we're more intent if and if we're showing kids like, yeah, I'm a little bit worried about this, but here's what I'm telling myself to get through these challenging times. I
Yeah.
think that could be a very helpful response.
Yeah, I so many good ideas, and I appreciate very much addressing the systems needs and the systems issue. Each of us only exist, you know, are individuals within a system, and I think it's important to remember both what we don't have control over and what structures need to be in place to have the biggest impact for
Mhm.
ourselves, for our students, at home, for our children. But I think it's also just disempowering to say there's nothing I can do
Absolutely.
because I have no support and because of all of these other things. Um, it's just very helpful to say those things are going to be slow to change, or not saying they won't change, but they're making baby steps in the right direction. But I can start doing these things today. I think,
Yes.
I just think more people need that full picture. And you described it so beautifully. And I thank you so much for your time with this and your
Absolutely.
expertise.
Absolutely. Yeah. I share your passion for sharing good resources with people, simple strategies. People, I mean, just to support that point, we tend to make one common thinking there, which is that events cause us to feel a certain way. And, and we know that that's not true, because the same event can happen to two different people, and they could have totally different emotional reactions about it.
Yeah.
And
That's
even,
such a
even
good
with this,
point.
even in this current crisis, you can look around and you could see some people really anxious and worried about it, and some people experiencing the exact same event who are staying calm and realistic about it. And
Mhm.
so the difference between those two people is what they're saying to themselves about this event. And the second part is it's our thoughts and it's our behaviors. It's the things that they're doing. So the structures and routines are our behaviors. The thoughts are, those two things are driving what our emotional reactions are. So we might as well capitalize on the things we have control over, those two things.
Mhm. Absolutely. Hope is very important. And
Yep.
what we can change. Do you have any final comments or remarks?
Oh, just the teachers are amazing, important people, and
Absolutely.
and um, and we're all gonna get through this. So,
Thank you so much, Professor Keith Herman. Nice to see
oh,
you.
great to see you, Melissa, and thanks for your effort and sharing good resources for people. So.